December 17th, 1944. Ardennes Forest. The morning began with silence, the kind that only deep winter can create. Frost clung to the pine branches. A faint mist rolled between the trees, swallowing sound, swallowing men. Inside a makeshift command post near the front, German officers huddled around a field map lit by a single lantern. The scouts had been sent out hours ago, yet no word had returned. Radios hissed with static. The only noise was the occasional creak of metal from frozen vehicles lined along the forest road. Major Kruger leaned forward, uneasy. Something about the stillness was wrong. The Americans should have been miles away. At least that's what reconnaissance had reported last night. Then the ground trembled. A low, rolling thunder swept through the valley. Before anyone could react, the first shells landed, direct hits, tearing through the trees and detonating along the road. Panic followed. How could they already know this position? The artillery was impossibly precise, impossibly fast. Kruger shouted for his radio man, but the air had already turned to fire. The Germans had just realized. American guns had reached them long before their scouts ever could. By the winter of 1944, the balance of power on the Western Front had shifted beyond recovery for Nazi Germany. What had once been a war of movement and blitzkrieg had become a desperate struggle of endurance and communication. And in that war, the Americans had begun to master something the Germans no longer could: coordination. The Ardennes Offensive, what the Allies would later call the Battle of the Bulge, was Adolf Hitler's final gamble. Launched in mid-December, it was meant to split the Allied armies and force a negotiated peace. The plan depended on secrecy, surprise, and speed, the very elements that had fueled German victories in 1939 and 1940. But in 1944, the battlefield was not the same. The Americans had learned to turn information into a weapon. While German intelligence networks were collapsing under Allied bombing and broken supply lines, the U.S. Army's communication systems were thriving. By late 1944, every major American artillery unit was connected by wire, radio, and relay, forming a kind of nervous system across the front. Observation posts, forward patrols, and aerial spotters constantly fed back coordinates. Every piece of data, every movement of the enemy, was noted, relayed, and plotted in real time. And then there was the technology. The Americans had introduced a concept the Germans underestimated: fire coordination centers. Command posts dedicated entirely to synchronizing artillery fire across multiple battalions. Instead of single batteries firing at visible targets, dozens of guns could be aligned on grid coordinates calculated to the meter. What looked like a random hillside could be transformed into a storm of shrapnel within seconds. This was not luck, nor guesswork. It was mathematics, communication, and patience. When the Americans advanced through France, they carried miles of cable and portable switchboards with them. Even in the most remote outposts, operators were connecting divisions through telephone networks that rivaled small cities. The result was astonishing. Artillery could strike anywhere, even beyond what the enemy believed possible. German commanders had once prided themselves on their flexible, decentralized control. Auftragstaktik, tactic, the art of independent action within intent. But by 1944, that system had begun to collapse. Shortages of fuel, ammunition, and functioning radio sets left many forward units blind. Orders that once moved in minutes now took hours. Reconnaissance, once the eyes of the Wehrmacht, had been dulled by constant air patrols and ambushes. In contrast, the Americans were operating like a single organism. When scouts or aerial observers sighted movement, the information traveled almost instantly to artillery coordination centers. Shells were calculated, loaded, and fired in minutes, often before the Germans even realized they had been seen. By December, this difference had grown fatal. In the snowy forests of Belgium and Luxembourg, speed was everything, and the Americans, with their invisible network of cables and radios, now possessed the one thing Germany had built its legend on: initiative. The men in those forests could not see the full system that was closing in around them. To them, it felt supernatural, as if the enemy could see through fog, through trees, through time itself. But the truth was far more human. It was born from planning, discipline, and the cold logic of communication. When the shells fell that morning on Major Kruger's position, it was not by accident. Somewhere miles behind the front, in a heated tent filled with radio chatter, an American artillery officer had received a brief message. Enemy vehicles sighted, grid 24/7-1. Within moments, multiple batteries from different divisions were calculating range, adjusting fuses, and firing in unison. The German scouts hadn't failed. They had simply been outpaced by a new kind of warfare. The war was no longer about who could move fastest across the field. It was about who could think, communicate, and strike before the other even knew where to look. And as the snow began to fall again across the Ardennes, that truth was becoming painfully clear. In the weeks leading to that morning, the Allied Artillery Command had refined its system into something that felt more like science than warfare. It was not the thunder of individual cannons that made it terrifying. It was the coordination. Dozens of batteries scattered across miles of terrain, firing in precise unison, as though controlled by a single unseen hand. The secret lay in the fire direction centers, mobile headquarters run by officers trained in ballistics, meteorology, and mathematics. They gathered weather data, wind speed, air, temperature, and even soil density. Every shell's path was computed to land with near mathematical certainty. The Germans had never faced an enemy whose gunnery was that systematic. Then came another edge: aerial spotting. Tiny reconnaissance planes, the Piper L-4, Grasshopper, flew low over the treetops, invisible to radar, guiding artillery through coded radio bursts. Each pilot carried maps marked with coordinates, and each observer spoke directly to gunners dozens of miles away. They saw what the ground troops could not, and they turned that vision into immediate destruction. Every time the Americans advanced, these eyes in the sky reported targets faster than any German scout on foot could ever hope to. German officers began to suspect their lines were infiltrated, that spies were marking their positions. They could not comprehend that a simple two-seater plane, flying at treetop height, could direct an entire division's firepower. By mid-December 1944, as the Battle of the Bulge unfolded, the situation had become surreal. Hitler's armored divisions, hidden under the dense winter forest, depended on secrecy to move. Yet secrecy itself was dying. Even when Allied aircraft were grounded by snow and fog, the Americans adapted. They turned to sound ranging, a network of microphones spread along the front that triangulated enemy artillery by sound alone. Within seconds of a German battery opening fire, its position was pinpointed and counter-bombarded. Meanwhile, the U.S. Army Signal Corps was laying miles of cable behind advancing infantry. Their telephone exchanges linked artillery units, observation posts, and command headquarters into a web of steel and wire. Messages that once took hours now traveled in seconds. Every battalion commander knew where every gun was, and every gun could be called upon without hesitation. To the German side, this coordination was invisible, and therefore terrifying. Officers who once relied on their own scouts and map reading now found themselves blind. Reconnaissance patrols sent out at dawn often never returned. When they did, their reports were outdated the moment they arrived. American artillery had already adjusted, already fired, already moved. The front was no longer a line of trenches or hills. It had become a dynamic, living network of communication. The Americans had found a way to merge intelligence, timing, and logistics into one seamless operation. In the early days of the Ardennes counteroffensive, German divisions like the 26th Volksgrenadier and 2nd Panzer made initial progress. They punched through weak Allied lines, captured small towns, and even forced temporary retreats. But behind the chaos, the U.S. artillery was awakening. The moment German forces broke into open ground, every available gun from neighboring sectors was redirected toward them. And with each passing hour, the illusion of German surprise began to crumble. Their fuel trucks were hit before reaching the front. Their convoys were shelled without being sighted, and their command posts, supposedly hidden deep in the forest, were being targeted with uncanny accuracy. Rumors spread among the ranks that the Americans had spies in every unit, that their shells could home in on speech, that they had machines capable of predicting movements. The truth was simpler. It was the triumph of organized intelligence. For decades, warfare had depended on courage, instinct, and the commander's intuition. But in the forests of the Ardennes, a new reality emerged. Information itself had become the weapon. The thunder that fell on Major Kruger's outpost that morning wasn't merely an artillery strike. It was the culmination of a transformation, a shift from the chaos of war to the cold precision of coordination. And for the first time, the Germans faced a battlefield where victory would not belong to the boldest, but to the best connected. There were many ways to understand what happened that morning in the Ardennes. Tactically, it was a lesson in speed. Technologically, it was the triumph of synchronization. But above all, it was the moment when communication became as lethal as gunpowder. The American artillery system in late 1944 was no longer just a support arm. It was a strategic weapon in itself. Each division's firepower could be pooled, redirected, or concentrated on a single grid point, overwhelming anything unfortunate enough to be within range. The U.S. Army called it time on target. Every battery, no matter how distant, calculated its firing time so that shells from multiple locations would arrive simultaneously. To the enemy, it felt like the sky itself exploded at once. For the Germans, who had spent years perfecting the art of local superiority, moving swiftly, striking hard, and withdrawing before response, this kind of orchestration was unimaginable. They were used to duels between guns, barrages that built up gradually. The American fire, by contrast, was invisible until the final second. Behind this precision lay an immense technological backbone. Field telephones and radios tied each forward observer to his battery. But more importantly, every artillery group was linked to the Army Group Fire Direction Center, the brain that coordinated the guns of entire divisions. These centers used topographic maps, ballistic tables, and slide rules to compute firing solutions that spanned miles. Even more revolutionary was the radar-assisted gunnery. In late 1944, the U.S. Army began fielding counter-battery radars capable of detecting incoming German shells and calculating their origin. Within minutes, American guns could respond, not randomly, but precisely, returning fire to the exact coordinates of the German battery. To the soldiers in the mud, it felt like the Americans could see through the ground itself. And then there were the logistics, the quiet, unglamorous machinery of war. American artillery functioned because it was fed relentlessly. Ammunition convoys, escorted by MPs, rolled day and night through the Ardennes' narrow forest roads. Each gun crew could fire hundreds of rounds per day, because somewhere behind them, entire supply trains were keeping pace. The Wehrmacht, by contrast, was starving. Every round fired by a German battery required fuel that might never arrive, or horses that might collapse in the snow. Their famed 88mm guns, devastating in defense, could not match the sustained barrage of American 155s when logistics broke down. Yet the most decisive advantage wasn't mechanical. It was the system's adaptability. Every American gunner, from corporal to colonel, had been trained to think independently within a larger network. If a line was cut, if a radio failed, another channel was opened. It was the opposite of the rigid command culture now paralyzing the German side. For years, the Wehrmacht's strength had been its commanders, bold men with the authority to improvise. But by 1944, that independence had vanished beneath Hitler's obsession with control. Orders came from above, slowly, with suspicion and delay. Field reports were filtered through layers of bureaucracy. Even when local commanders saw opportunities, they hesitated, waiting for permission that never came. The Americans had no such hesitation. A forward observer with a radio could request fire from multiple batteries without consulting Division HQ. If he saw movement, the guns would respond in minutes. This decentralization, rooted in trust and training, created a form of organized chaos that the Germans simply couldn't match. When the first shells began falling on the German command post that December morning, they were the physical expression of an unseen contest, a race between two doctrines. One, hierarchical, built on obedience and fear. The other, dynamic, built on connection and initiative. And for the first time in the war, the latter had become the deadlier of the two. From the outside, it appeared as though the Americans had perfected prediction itself. But in truth, it was the logical outcome of thousands of men doing their jobs with mechanical precision. Clerks, signalers, mathematicians, drivers, all moving data and shells faster than the enemy could comprehend. The war was no longer about who had the biggest guns. It was about who could connect them the fastest. As the German officers stared into the burning forest, they were not witnessing luck. They were witnessing the future. A battlefield ruled not by generals on horseback, but by circuits, wires, and timing tables. Beyond tactics and technology, the human dimension of that day was what made it unforgettable. For the men inside the German bunkers, the shock wasn't only in the explosions, it was in the realization that they were suddenly powerless. Veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front described American fire as something different, almost mechanical. It didn't build up like Soviet barrages. It struck without warning, vanishing as quickly as it began, only to return minutes later at a new location. Every shell seemed to know exactly where to fall. Even seasoned officers found themselves questioning how such precision was possible. They had once considered themselves the masters of modern warfare, heirs of Clausewitz, tacticians who rewrote the laws of speed and coordination. Yet now, in the frozen stillness of the Ardennes, they were being undone by an enemy who fought not with audacity, but with mathematics. Inside command dugouts, disbelief turned to fear. Messages from forward scouts arrived late, or not at all. Roads that had been safe the previous night were cratered by morning. Ammunition trucks were burning before they could unload. It felt less like being outmaneuvered and more like being outseen, as though every move was being watched by an invisible eye. Among German ranks, rumors spread quickly. Some soldiers swore the Americans had developed a soundless gun. Others whispered about aircraft equipped with heat sensors, or spies using invisible transmitters to mark their positions. No one could explain how an army could strike so fast, with such accuracy, without ever showing itself. On the American side, there was no sense of mystery, only process. Inside the field tents and command trailers, the scene was methodical, quiet, almost routine. Officers hunched over topographical maps, sliding metal rulers across grid lines. Assistants calculated trajectories using firing tables, adjusting for wind, elevation, and powder temperature. Telephonists relayed coordinates in monotone voices. Gunners waited for the final numbers, their hands steady on cold metal levers. When the fire order came, it was brief and absolute. Battery, 3 rounds, fire for effect. Then came the roar, the recoil, the hiss of hot casings rolling onto frozen mud. They did not see their targets, nor the men they struck. To them, the war existed in numbers, bearings, and impact times. And yet, every successful strike, every plume of smoke rising from enemy lines, meant fewer American soldiers would die on the ground. For some, that knowledge made the precision comforting. For others, it was haunting. Many artillerymen later admitted that they felt detached from the destruction they caused. They heard only the echo of their own guns, not the screams that followed miles away. The battlefield had grown distant, abstract, and with it, so had the human cost. Back in the German positions, the psychological toll was immense. A soldier could no longer rely on instinct or cover. Even deep trenches were not safe. Veterans spoke of hearing the faint rustle of snow, followed by seconds of silence, then the sky breaking apart above them. The randomness of death had become precise. For commanders, it was worse. The belief that discipline and planning could outmatch chaos, that the German mind could control the battlefield, was collapsing. When American shells landed directly on radio trucks, messengers, and observation posts. They destroyed not just machines, but morale. Communication lines fell silent. Officers began issuing orders by runner, the same way their fathers had in 1914. In a single winter, the Germans had gone backward in time, while their enemy had moved forward by decades. The men who survived the bombardments began to speak of a new kind of war, one fought in silence and speed, where the enemy struck not by sight, but by signal. Even if they retreated, they knew the truth could not be undone. The Americans had crossed an invisible threshold. This was no longer a contest of strength or courage. It was a contest of systems, of information, timing, and adaptability. And those who could not evolve were already losing, even before the guns fired. The forest quieted again after each barrage. Snow would fall on the twisted metal, muffling the echoes of war. But beneath that silence, the reality was undeniable. The battlefield itself had changed forever. The next phase of the conflict, the true breaking point, was about to arrive. And when it came, it didn't announce itself with the thunder of artillery, but with a whisper. The kind of whisper that slid through the trees before dawn, boots crunching softly in the frost, breath caught in the fabric of gas hoods, the soft click of bolts being drawn back. The men of the 132nd waited in that pale half-light. Their rifles pointed toward the fog that rolled low across the frozen river. No one spoke. No one dared. They had already learned that sound was invitation. And on this front, invitation meant death. Captain Mikhail stood with his glove pressed against the cold barrel of his Mosin Nagant, eyes fixed on the fog. He could feel it. That invisible weight pressing against his chest, the sense that the world was holding its breath. Somewhere inside that gray blur, movement shifted. Shadows, dozens of them, gliding low, almost soundless. "Now," he whispered. The word barely left his mouth before the night erupted. Tracer fire tore across the riverbank, shredding the calm, and the forest roared alive again. Grenades cracked, muzzle flashes painted the snow orange, and within seconds the world dissolved into chaos. Men stumbled through the haze, their outlines vanishing as quickly as they appeared. Smoke and snow fused into one ghostly curtain. The air stank of cordite and blood. Mikhail shouted orders, but his voice was swallowed whole. He saw Anton, the youngest of them, dragging a wounded soldier behind the wreckage of a burned-out truck. Then, without warning, the entire horizon flashed. A new explosion, closer this time, shaking the earth and filling the air with splinters of burning pine. He hit the ground hard, the taste of soil and gunpowder in his mouth. His ears rang, his thoughts scattered. And yet, through the ringing, he heard it, a low mechanical hum, alien to the front. It wasn't artillery. It wasn't tanks. He looked up just in time to see the fog split open, a convoy of unfamiliar armored shapes crawling forward through the haze. New German machines coated in frost, their insignias barely visible beneath layers of ice. Their engines purred like predators. The Soviets had never seen these before. "Mikhail!" someone screamed from the left flank. "They're not stopping!" The captain forced himself up, heart hammering as the machines rolled closer. For the first time, he felt something he hadn't in months. Not fear of death, but fear of what was coming after. Because this was not just another counterattack. This was the dawn of a new kind of war. Colder, faster, more merciless. And as the snow continued to fall, covering the bodies and the twisted remnants of the old front, it felt almost deliberate, as if the earth itself was trying to bury what humanity had just unleashed. The forest, once a silent witness, was no longer watching. It was listening. By mid-morning, the mist had begun to lift, revealing the devastation that had once been hidden by darkness. What was left of the forest now looked more like the surface of another world. Trees torn in half by shells, trenches swallowed by mud, and the faint trail of retreating soldiers disappearing into the whiteness. From the American side, The sound of movement resumed, deliberate, heavy, and coordinated. The artillery units had not only survived the night's chaos, they were preparing to move forward. Lieutenant Frank Holbrook, commander of Battery C, stood on the turret of his M7 Priest self-propelled gun. The tracks below him churned the frozen mud as the column rolled out of the tree line. He adjusted his goggles, peering across the clearing where just hours before, German shells had fallen like thunder. Now it was theirs. "Range?" he asked quietly. 4 miles, sir," came the reply from below. "We're hitting beyond the river bend." Holbrook nodded once. The men knew what that meant. They were firing beyond what the maps had shown, deeper into enemy-held territory than any Allied artillery unit had dared yet attempt. When the first barrage came, it wasn't a ripple of distant thunder. It was a wall of sound. Hundreds of shells arced through the pale morning sky, descending like iron rain. Through binoculars, officers could see the ground erupt in staggered waves, flashes rolling down the valley like lightning crawling sideways. On the German side, it caused confusion bordering on disbelief. The front lines were supposed to be safe from American guns. Scouts had reported the enemy artillery far behind the forest, their range limited by terrain. But now, shells were falling where no Allied gun should have reached. Command posts erupted in shouting. Runners tripped over cables as they delivered orders already obsolete. The rangefinders gave no explanation, only impossible data. Oberstleutnant Wilhelm Kramer, commanding the sector's artillery response, stared at the impact maps in silence. He had spent 20 years in artillery, from Poland to France, across Russia's frozen plains, and he knew the limits of every Allied piece by heart. Yet what he saw now broke all logic. "They're firing over the forest?" his adjutant stammered. "Not over," Kramer murmured, his voice distant. "Through." He didn't realize it yet, but Holbrook's unit was using newly calculated elevation angles, the result of weeks of field testing in secrecy. The Americans had adapted their 155mm howitzers for indirect, high-arc fire that could curve over terrain and strike unseen targets far beyond their theoretical limits. For the first time, the Germans' carefully layered defense was being dismantled by mathematics. The line that had held since winter began now shook with every detonation. By afternoon, reports came in that several forward command posts were destroyed, communications down, and entire companies retreating without orders. Soldiers who had once mocked the American pace now whispered of a new kind of precision, silent, unseen, and relentless. The artillery wasn't just supporting the infantry anymore. It was the spearhead. Holbrook's men moved methodically, setting up new positions as they advanced. Mud clung to their boots, breath froze in the air, but their spirits were unbroken. For once, they weren't reacting. They were dictating the battlefield. In the ruined farmhouse that served as a temporary HQ, Holbrook unrolled a map on the hood of a Jeep. His hand traced the red line of their new range. It reached territory that, just yesterday, had been beyond imagination. "Mark that point," he said. "That's where they'll fall next." He didn't smile. He only watched as the pencil touched the paper, the line extending farther into the heart of enemy ground. Outside, the men loaded fresh shells into the breach, their rhythm steady, the air shaking with the drumbeat of steel. The forest echoed once more. But this time, the echoes carried a different sound, the sound of an army realizing its own evolution. The Germans, retreating through the smoldering valley, began to understand that what they faced was not luck, not weather, not chance. It was the arrival of a new kind of warfare, faster, more precise, and utterly unforgiving. And as night approached again, the snow fell soft and steady over the wreckage, blanketing the earth as if to hide what humanity had become capable of. The line had been breached, not by tanks, not by men, but by numbers written on paper, calculated in silence, and unleashed in fire. When dawn broke again over the Ardennes, the forest no longer looked like a battlefield. It looked like the remains of an experiment that had gone too far. Smoke drifted between the skeletal trees, rising from craters still warm with the heat of the previous night's shelling. Snow had melted in patches where iron had kissed the ground, and scattered among the churned earth were the unmistakable remains of Germany's once proud forward line. Helmets, burned equipment, and broken field radios crackling with ghost signals. The first American infantrymen who entered those woods moved slowly, rifles raised but unchallenged. What they found was silence. No ambush, no resistance, only the eerie, almost reverent quiet that follows total destruction. Some said it felt like stepping into a graveyard before the burials had even taken place. The reports came in quickly. Entire sections of the 212th Volksgrenadier Division had vanished overnight. Their artillery positions, once thought untouchable, were obliterated. Precision hits that could not have been achieved by chance. American officers began referring to it in hushed tones as the night the line folded on sound alone. For the Germans, the shock was not merely tactical, it was psychological. They had spent years believing their intelligence network and terrain advantage made them untouchable within these forests. Their scouts, their maps, their timing, all of it had been the spine of their defensive confidence. Now, in a single day, that spine had snapped. Captured soldiers, trembling in the cold, spoke of confusion more than fear. They said the shells seemed to fall faster than word could travel, as if the Americans were reading their plans before they acted. Some believed new spy planes had been used. Others whispered of coded transmissions intercepted by unseen machines. None guessed the truth, that the change had come from the ground, not the sky. The American advance that followed was cautious but steady. Infantry columns crept forward behind the creeping barrage, their boots sinking into the thawing mud that had swallowed so many before them. They found German guns still warm, positions abandoned mid-firing sequence, coffee cups frozen beside dead radios. One corporal later wrote in his letter home, "It felt like we walked into a place where the war had already ended, but no one told the men who died here." In headquarters, the significance of what had happened spread quickly. Intelligence officers connected the dots. This wasn't a lucky strike. It was proof that American artillery had reached operational superiority. Using new ballistic tables developed by the Ballistic Research Laboratory, units had calculated angles and charges so precisely that terrain no longer mattered. Mountains, forests, valleys, all could now be struck as if they were open fields. For commanders, it was revolutionary. For the men on the ground, it was haunting. Holbrook's battery, the same that had fired the first impossible barrage, was ordered to hold position and await resupply. The men sat quietly among their guns, drinking from tin cups, their faces pale under the winter sun. Some laughed softly at the sudden quiet. Others stared at the shell cases stacked like small monuments beside them. War had changed overnight, but no one quite knew what that meant. Back across the lines, German medical units moved among the wounded under white flags. The cries of the injured echoed faintly through the trees. They carried men whose ears bled from the concussions, whose minds had broken under the shock of bombardment. One medic, his uniform blackened with soot, wrote in his diary, "It wasn't the fire that destroyed them. It was the waiting, not knowing where it would fall next." In command rooms far behind the front, both sides began rewriting their playbooks. American strategists saw this as confirmation of an emerging doctrine: mobility through precision. Artillery, long viewed as a supporting arm, could now lead the assault. German officers, meanwhile, were forced to confront the one thing their doctrine had never planned for: the loss of initiative. Orders were issued to pull remaining artillery units back, widen dispersal, and conceal coordinates with false signals. But such measures were reactionary. The damage was already done. The front, once defined by kilometers of trenches and fixed points, had dissolved into a haze of shifting coordinates and invisible reach. It wasn't just a battle won. It was the beginning of a transformation. By evening, American engineers arrived to mark firing positions and measure range performance. Their findings astonished even them. The shell impacts matched predictions within 30 meters, an unheard-of accuracy for that range and weather. Mathematics had triumphed where manpower never could. Holbrook's superior, Colonel Warren Ellsworth, visited the site before sunset. He walked silently through the devastation, boots crunching over shattered branches and twisted steel. When he reached the line of guns, he paused beside Holbrook. The younger officer saluted, but Ellsworth only looked out toward the horizon. "Doesn't feel like victory," he said quietly. Holbrook didn't answer. He didn't need to. They both understood. What they had accomplished here would change warfare, but at a cost that neither could yet define. As night fell once again, the artillerymen prepared for another barrage, this time on fresh coordinates further east. Snowflakes drifted gently over their helmets, melting on the warm barrels of their guns. Each man knew his part by heart now. Check elevation, load, fire, adjust. But something had shifted in their eyes, a mixture of pride and unease. They were soldiers, yes, but they had become something else too. Instruments of an unseen calculation. Their success came not from courage or instinct, but from numbers, from equations that determined life or death at distances too great to see. And as the order came down to fire again, a strange thought settled among them, that somewhere, far beyond the forest, men were about to die, not because of what they'd done, but because the math said they would. The night lit up once more. The snow carried the reflection of flames, painting the forest gold and red. And as the last shell left the barrel, echoing across the valley, the silence that followed was heavier than the sound itself. It was not the silence of victory. It was the silence of realization. In the weeks that followed, reports from the Ardennes filtered slowly through the chain of command, crossing from field telephones to headquarters briefings, from snow-choked trenches to polished tables in Allied war rooms. At first, the event was described simply as a tactical success, another minor American advance during the winter counteroffensive. But those who studied the range data knew it was something far more significant. The artillery performance during that operation had rewritten the rules of engagement. For the first time, the Americans had projected sustained, precise fire beyond terrain-defined limits, striking enemy positions they could not even see. What had begun as an act of adaptation, born of desperation and field ingenuity, was now recognized as a doctrine, deep fire capability. Colonel Ellsworth's after-action report reached the War Department in late December 1944. In it, he outlined the mathematical refinements to the firing tables, recalculations based on air temperature, shell weight, propellant behavior in extreme cold, and curvature of terrain. The methods, tested under battlefield pressure, had produced an effective range increase of nearly 20%. It was, as one analyst wrote, the quiet revolution of the Ardennes. Word spread quickly among the technical divisions. At Aberdeen Proving Ground in Maryland, engineers and mathematicians pored over the data transmitted from Europe. They confirmed the near-perfect accuracy of the fire missions, calling it statistically improbable, yet repeatable. Suddenly, the science of artillery, long treated as a mixture of guesswork and intuition, had become a precise discipline, driven by numbers instead of instinct. Across the Atlantic, German intelligence units were equally swift in their investigation. Captured fragments of American shell casings were examined, but they revealed nothing unusual. The mystery lay not in the weapon itself, but in the method. Field Marshal Model demanded explanations from his artillery commanders. How had the Americans reached so far, so fast? Some blamed new propellant mixtures. Others blamed Allied air reconnaissance. But none wanted to admit the truth. The Americans had learned to think differently. The shock rippled through German command culture, already fraying under pressure from the Allied advance. For years, their doctrine had relied on superior coordination and faster movement, the tempo that allowed them to outmaneuver slower enemies. But in the Ardennes, that tempo had been stolen from them. How do you maneuver when the enemy's range has no boundaries? In early January 1945, new orders were issued from OKW headquarters in Ziegenberg. All frontline artillery positions were to increase dispersion by 50%. No gun was to remain in a fixed location longer than 12 hours. Supply convoys would operate at night only, under blackout conditions. The Germans were adapting, but every adaptation slowed them down further, tightening the vice, already closing on their collapsing lines. Meanwhile, on the Allied side, the psychological effect of the breakthrough was profound. For the first time since the onset of winter, morale soared. The men who had trudged through endless forests under freezing rain now carried themselves differently. They had seen what precision could do, what science could achieve when harnessed to discipline. New training programs began at once. Artillery schools across Europe incorporated the Ardennes data into their manuals. Field officers were instructed in advanced plotting techniques using slide rules, aerial maps, and weather logs. The art of gunnery was transforming into a science, one that no longer relied on instinct but on measurable certainty. Holbrook's battery, still stationed near the destroyed forest line, became an unlikely legend. Engineers and photographers visited to document their methods. They posed reluctantly beside their M7 priests, exhausted and hollow-eyed but proud. Behind them, the horizon was blackened with the smoke of burning armor, the evidence of what their calculations had done. In one photograph, taken on New Year's Eve, Holbrook stands beside his gun, snow clinging to his jacket. His expression is unreadable, not victory, not satisfaction, only the look of a man who knows he's glimpsed something that will not be undone. That photo would later appear in military archives with the caption, "First confirmed instance of extended-range indirect fire in European theater." As winter turned to spring, the lessons of that December day echoed through every major campaign that followed. During the crossing of the Rhine, American artillery opened fire from positions once deemed unreachable, crippling enemy defenses before tanks ever moved. In Italy, in France, in the shattered remains of Germany itself, the same principle was applied. Strike first, strike unseen, strike with math. The war's closing months became a study in precision. Each shell, each trajectory, each timing was a product of computation. The battlefield had turned into a grid of probabilities, and humanity had learned to fight through equations. For the Germans, the psychological toll deepened. Veterans who had survived the Eastern Front described this new form of fire as ghost artillery, invisible, omnipresent, merciless. Morale collapsed faster than supply lines. Many units surrendered at the mere sound of incoming barrages, convinced they were surrounded. Fear had replaced strategy. In post-war analysis, Allied historians would later write that this moment, the American artillery breakthrough at the Ardennes, was not simply a tactical success, but the birth of modern ballistic warfare. It marked the shift from war as a contest of bravery and numbers to war as a contest of data and precision. A transformation that would define not just the final battles of the Second World War, but every conflict that followed. Back in the forest, long after the guns had gone silent, the earth bore the scars of that realization. The craters filled with rainwater and ice, forming dark pools that mirrored the sky. Wild grass grew between the twisted wrecks of half-tracks and cannons, reclaiming the land inch by inch. Locals would later say that in spring, when the wind passed through the ruins, it sounded like distant thunder, as if the echoes of that December morning still wandered through the trees. Holbrook returned home in 1946 to a quiet town in Illinois. He never spoke much about the war. When asked about the Ardennes, he would only say, "We learned to hit what we couldn't see." That was the beginning and the end of everything. His words, though simple, captured the essence of what that battle had meant. It was victory born not from courage or numbers, but from knowledge. And knowledge once awakened could never be contained again. The forest that had once hidden an army had witnessed a new kind of weapon rise, the mind. And though snow would fall there again, soft and clean, it could never quite cover what humanity had discovered in those frozen days of 1944. When the last shell casing was buried beneath snow and silence, the war continued elsewhere. But something fundamental had shifted. The battlefield was no longer a place defined by sight and courage alone. It had become an equation. The American gunners who had stood in the frost that December didn't see themselves as revolutionaries. They were men following orders, loading shells, calculating angles, adjusting elevation in the cold. Yet what they accomplished reached far beyond that moment. They proved that precision could replace proximity, that a soldier could destroy what he could not see, predict what he could not feel. For centuries, war had depended on closeness, sword to shield, rifle to trench. But in those Ardennes woods, that intimacy died quietly beneath falling snow. The gunner's hand no longer trembled over a trigger pulled in fear or rage. It hovered instead over coordinates, numbers scribbled on paper, decisions that would ripple miles away. Historians would later write that this was the beginning of the modern era of warfare, the rise of long-range fire, of data, of invisible violence. But for those who were there, it was something simpler and far heavier. Because with distance came detachment, and with detachment came a new kind of burden, the knowledge that one could destroy precisely, efficiently, and without ever seeing the faces on the other side. Holbrook, in his later years, described it best. We learned how far we could reach. The question we never stopped asking was, should we have? The forest has long since healed. Trees have grown tall again where guns once stood. Birds nest where shells once fell. But when wind passes through on winter mornings, it still carries a low, rolling sound, like distant thunder over frozen ground. Some say it's the echo of artillery long silenced. Others say it's the earth remembering what man taught it, that silence after war is never really silent. It only waits for someone to listen. Because once, in the heart of winter, a handful of men in a ruined forest learned that knowledge could reach farther than courage ever could, and the world has never been the same since.